Welcome to the TTS Talking Educators podcast. Each week we'll be joined by educational experts from across the globe, offering exclusive insights, inspiration and guidance to help practitioners unlock the potential for learning in educational settings. Hi, my name is Dr. Shaddai Tembo, your host for this week's TTS Talking Educators podcast. I'm a senior lecturer at Bath University, an associate lecturer at the Open University, and an independent speaker, writer and consultant with critical early years. Throughout this series, we'll be discussing a range of topics aimed at supporting literacy in primary and early years settings, inspiring you with a range of guidance and resources to enhance your practice. Now, this week, I'm delighted to introduce Adam Marycz as our guest. Welcome to the podcast. Adam, how are you today?
Hi, Shaddai. I'm all good, thank you. You?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm keen to get into this conversation. Just before we get started, though, perhaps you could give yourself an introduction for our listeners.
Yeah, of course, thank you. Yeah, I'm Adam Marycz. I am the Early Years Education Consultant at TTS Resources, primarily supporting settings and educators, to understand a little bit more about the educational side of what TTS do and what they might have in their environment, and ensuring that they can really sort of utilise that to its best. But prior to joining here, I was an early years teacher and nursery and wraparound provision manager for 13, 14 years, working with children primarily from birth, but also through to 11 in both education and care environments, and helping to support families and educators around that, and then just done some work outside where presented at some some conferences and doing some writing and that kind of thing, just to help to try and support the conversation, that critical thinking and critical discussion that I think is absolutely vital for any kind of growth, either as an individual or professionally as well.
Excellent. And in this episode, we're talking about the power of speaking and listening. But before we get into that, perhaps it's worth thinking about the broader context around digital technology at the moment, which I know is something on a lot of educators and parents' minds. How does that intersect with what we're talking about here, with the need for good, effective communication and language with young children?
So I think, it's, like I say, digital the children's relationships with digital technology is a huge conversation. I think we've seen, when we touched on it before, we touched on the pandemic in a previous episode, and I think when we think about how in recent years children have started to access digital technology, have probably use tablets and iPads a lot more, phones, spend a lot more time in front of screens and a lot more time watching television. Again, we go back to the pandemic where that, there was certainly that with parents trying to juggle their home and work life, and it involved children building their understanding of language and their understanding of communication from screens and from that sort of one-way interaction. And I think that's probably the most important part of thinking about digital technology, certainly from a screen perspective, is that it might help children to hear and to listen to more language than without it, especially, for example, if, say, working parents were at home and they didn't necessarily have that time for that one-to-one interaction, but it doesn't provide that opportunity for those back and forth conversations. It doesn't provide children with the opportunity to practice the pronunciation of words. Even the challenges that I remember seeing back in my setting in that time was actually about the way that children were pronouncing words and the accents that they were using to pronounce words. If they spent a lot of time watching, YouTube is full of what is often quite Americanized videos and Americanized content, so you've got children who are potentially understanding words and sounds and even phonics. I know, think about in reception when children are starting to and early years provision when children are starting to read and children are starting to build that phonetic understanding. If that understanding has come from a position where that they're not necessarily hearing sounds pronounced in the way that we do, that can make that phonetic learning very, very difficult. But that relationship is something that I think we're starting to see a conversation around, and around the use and implementation of screens in settings. I think about 10, 15 years ago, you had a lot of local authorities certainly invested in smart whiteboards, and having early years provision preschool and reception that had interactive whiteboards, and they were becoming the focus of how that learning took place. And now you potentially see a step away from that, because we're seeing a realization of the fact that children are, using screens a lot at home, and we're potentially seeing the impact of that on their communication language development. And actually, it might not have the positive impact that we hoped it would, and that it might, be a factor when we spoke earlier about many factors that are influencing the challenges that we're currently seeing in the communication language space within early years, and the fact that the use of technology can have a positive impact, but equally it can potentially have a negative one as well. And like I used the word balance in the previous episode, I think it's all about that balance, and it's about helping to understand that, and helping to realise that there are benefits to it, but there's also some things it can't replace. Like ultimately it can't replace that adult interaction, that back and forth, that conversation, that ability to understand context behind words. It simply doesn't replace how we can provide context to words in a way that watching a pre-recorded video on a screen just can't. It can't do that. It doesn't have that tangible effect. You can't. Children don't have a. If they're talking about a car, they don't. If the video is about a car, they don't have a car to actually look at and to inspect and to feel. And for those learners who need to inspect it and realise that that car is this, and that the two things coexist as use the same word but in those different contexts, it doesn't provide that different context for it.
Yeah, I think what you're saying there about the virtual and the physical environment and real 4D life resources is being really important for us is a really useful reminder of the importance of the physical space. And we spoke a bit about that in the first episode around inclusive language environment. And I'd like to return to that now, if that's okay, because reflecting on attention and this attention economy that we are all in society, but perhaps more and more with young children now, and the nature of distraction, that kind of feeds into conversations about language-rich environments and the appropriate amount of language within those environments. What's your sense of the balance there? Should nursery classrooms be plastered with resources and shiny posters everywhere, or does that perhaps lead to issues with distraction and children's attention? What's your sense of that?
I think it's a really interesting way that the conversation's gone in recent years. I think from my point of view, I'm very easily distracted. So my environment's never sort of had, low hanging things from the ceiling everywhere. And, there was a couple of display boards across the room, but it wasn't, displays, just sort of, because for the sake of displays, I guess, just because we want, it's about, again, that purpose and that intent. I think, if you're distracted easily, then it's very, very easy for that magpie just to go, oh, what's that over there, shiny, and then you're gone. And I think that idea of a language-rich environment, it's what the definition of that is. What is your definition of that? Like, my definition of language rich is, yes, there's opportunities for children to see language, whether you've got stories, whether you've got displays, whether you've got, examples of their work that have got that written language on it. But equally, that is not just what it is. Language rich is about having those spaces for talk. It's about having those spaces for children to learn new vocabulary, to have new vocabulary introduced to them, for that ability to converse, for the ability to have those interactions. Language which doesn't necessarily need to be that everything, that everything has got a poster on it, or that everything's got a label on it, or that everything's got, like you say, there's a display across the room, one for each topic that you've done across the term. I think that can just then become, it can easily become overwhelming for anybody, and it can become very distracting. And think again, like when you're thinking about that attention space and that distraction space, it's really difficult if you, as a reception teacher, I think about the expectations that are placed on the children when they step up from preschool to reception, the expectations of what attention looks like. What is attention? What is focus? What are you classing as? Is a child focused or not? I was last week at the Nursery World Big Data, and I was listening to Minier talk about attention in schools, and to talk about that idea of what does that look like. And someone introduced something mentioned something that I've not heard of previously, but a slant approach, which I think it's like about sitting up and looking and tracking the speaker and all that kind of thing. And it's like that expectation that we're placing on the children, that they are going and that attention is fully focused on that, and that's the only way that they can learn. So I think that's obviously it's a slightly, off on a tangent, but I think it all breeds into that attention, and all breeds into that focus, and all breeds into what your environments are, and that your environments to really help oracy flourish doesn't need to be examples of writing everywhere. It doesn't. It's provided, and it's not just adults sitting with children talking at them all the time. It's not about questioning children all the time. It's not about bombarding them with words. It's about providing them with the space where they can do that safely, whether they're doing that in a peer group, whether they're doing that with an adult, whether you're actually just pausing and allowing them to have the opportunity to process what's been said or to think about the response. I think one of the most important pieces of advice I remember ever getting is, the idea of the 10-second rule, the fact that you speak to a child and that you give them effectively around 10, 15, 20 seconds for them to process that before they respond. Because you can, at times, it's so easy to, you ask the child a question, you pose a statement to them, you speak to them, and if that interaction doesn't come back in 2 seconds, again, because attention, our attention's gone, and we're like, well, we just want that instantaneous reaction. But it's not. It's about providing that pause and actually allowing them to, digest and to process what you've said, and to find the vocabulary or find the words or find, their flashcard, whatever that is, to respond appropriately. That's so important, and it's something that, like, in the chaotic world that we live in, where I think we expect everything instantaneously, it's really, really easy to forget. And that's just a piece of advice I remember getting 15 years ago that's sort of really, really embedded in my mind.
Yeah, that's fascinating. There's a lot to unpick there. The real takeaway from what you're saying, I think, is that a language-rich environment is not an environment where language is forced onto children, but an environment in which language can emerge, in a really rich and meaningful way. And of course, that feeds into arguments for kind of less neurotypical spaces where attention isn't so expected on one particular thing, and children can express themselves in a multitude of ways. I guess something that feeds into that is noise. I've worked in lots of nursery settings and visited lots of nursery settings, and noise is quite a significant issue for a number of nurseries working or who are situated on a busy road or adjacent to a school. And I understand that can really affect oracy and children's opportunity to speak. I wonder if that's something you've noticed within your experience, and also what you might suggest to teachers trying to reflect on the auditory atmosphere and how that can enable children to develop more speaking, communication and language skills.
Again, background noise, and that is a really interesting one. Actually, as an individual, I really struggle to, if I'm, in an environment where there's a lot of background noise, I really struggle to decipher between those sounds. Like someone could be talking to me next to me, and I can't decipher what they're saying from everything else that's going on. And I think, when you're entering early year spaces, that is really, really difficult, because there is often a lot going on. And if there is a lot of talk and there is a lot of interaction, which is brilliant, and that's what you want, children obviously just get louder and louder and to hear each other, and then you've got that crescendo effect where you've suddenly got a very, very overwhelming space, and you've got a lot going on there. And I think it's about that. For me, it's about having those opportunities for quiet when we think about spaces, when we think about play spaces and environments. It's about having spaces where children can go, which is more quiet, which is not just supports their well-being and supports their ability to co and self-regulate, but actually just provides them with the space where they can go if it's too overwhelming and it's too chaotic, or it's too noisy, or there's too much going on. And it's about understanding each individual child and how they might best learn, and how they might best be able to regulate themselves and to support themselves and each other. And those conversations, when you're having them, making sure it comes back to those back and forth interactions, that ability to converse, ensuring that you're helping children and you're modelling to children that you don't talk over each other, and that it's not about who shouts the loudest that wins. It's about actually everybody will have the opportunity to share their views. Everyone will have the opportunity to interact, and everyone will have the opportunity to engage with each other if you just wait, essentially, wait that turn taking idea, that just helping to support children to do that, and be managing the group sizes that you've got. If you're doing if you're supporting the children with, say you're doing a math lesson, or for phonics, I just think to reception, you've got 30 children sat on the carpet trying to do phonics like that. That is difficult. That is overwhelming as a teacher. That's overwhelming as a child, because there's everyone is vying for that moment of attention, for that moment of interaction. And we think about, as children and as adults as well, we actually quite like one-to-one attention. Even as an adult, it's quite nice to have one-to-one attention rather than be sharing it with 30 other people. It is nice that, it makes you feel good. It helps your well-being. It helps you learn. It's the most impactful way if it's meaningful to you. So being able to do that and providing the opportunities for that is the most important. But equally, with the way the early years is at the moment, is also incredibly challenging. I fully appreciate that it's very difficult if you've got a room of 30 children to provide that ability for you to sit and talk to, Johnny one-to-one for 10, 15 minutes. It's really, really difficult to do that. At the moment, the sector's struggling with recruitment and retention crisis, so staffing is a huge challenge. So it's doing the best with what you've got. It's all appreciating that, at times it might not be perfect, but you can have a real impact. And if you can just have a one-to-one interaction with a child for 5-10 minutes a day, that can play such a significant role in their ability to develop their oracy skills moving forward. Because that might not be an interaction that they get everywhere else. We have to understand, everyone's got busy lives. As families are, very busy families. You think about children who families often finish, work at 5-6 o'clock. They're picking the children up. It's time for bath and bed, and then it's not time, sadly, to sit and have a half an hour, 40-minute conversation. So it's sort of understanding all the nuances around that, and just just sort of doing the best that we can to provide those high quality interactions and those ability. Even when the children are playing and they're engaged in that play, to provide that sustained shared thinking and that ability for you to sit there with a child and to help them problem solve and to help them debate their ideas and discuss and share their ideas, or share their challenges, and you help scaffold that play and scaffold that learning around that, and that interaction really will not just support their learning that's going on there. If they're building a tower, you're not just supporting their ability to balance, you're not just supporting their fine motor skills, you're not just supporting their ability to problem solve or their resilience if it keeps falling down. You're also just introducing new vocabulary. You're also embedding the context of that vocabulary. If you're saying, well, you're stacking that higher, then you're immediately helping the children to understand what higher means in a way they might not have thought of before, because they might have just spoken about, they might have spoken about higher when they're just looking at a pile of something. They may not realise that they can influence what is higher and what is lower, or that, by putting one brick on it's higher. They may just think their abstract concept of they look at something, and that is higher and taller. And applying language to all those different contexts is really, really important. And that's why vocabulary and context matters. And that's, again, coming back to where we were at the beginning. That's what you can't necessarily get from just watching a video or playing on an app or whatever that one-way interaction is. You can't necessarily understand that context there and those concepts in the way that you can either with your peers or with an adult.
Thanks so much for that, Adam. We've covered quite a lot in this episode. As you've just said, the role of digital technology and how that might affect children's oracy skills, but also what we mean by a language-rich environment and the need to make sure that our environments do contain sufficient space for children to be able to express themselves, and do have those spaces that are quieter when it does become overwhelming at certain times of the day. Those case studies you shared at the end were really useful, and I'm sure we'll pick up on that in the next episode. So thanks so much, Adam.
No problem. Thank you very much.
I'd like to say a huge thank you to our guest, Adam, for joining us and providing such valuable insights. You've been listening to the TTS Talking Educators podcast with me, Dr. Shaddai Tembo, and Adam Marycz. If you've been inspired by our conversation today, don't forget you can sign up via the link in our episode notes to be the first to hear about future episodes and access exclusive follow-up content, including ideas for your setting and links to relevant resources.